The lights in my barn flickered again, sending a stutter of shadows dancing across the wooden beams, and Bessie, my prize cow, let out an irritated moo that echoed through the rafters like a warning. It was the third time this week, and I was about 5 seconds away from grabbing a sledgehammer and taking it to my breaker box. Something was draining my electricity, and I couldn't figure out what. I had already checked for faulty wiring, overloaded circuits, even called the electric company, but they told me everything looked normal on their end. Normal, right. Tell that to the $200 spike on my last bill, or to Bessie, who was now glaring at me like I was the one playing disco games with her light. I stepped outside, muttering curses under my breath, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glint of orange in the moonlight, something barely noticeable against the grass, but then my eyes followed it, an extension cord. A long, bright, orange extension cord slithering out from my barn like a thief's rope, running across my fence line and disappearing straight into the side of my neighbor's house. My pulse spiked. My jaw clenched so tight I thought I'd crack a molar. That house belonged to Karen. Of course it did. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Karen, who once fined me for letting my grass grow half an inch over regulation height. Karen, who had spent the last 2 years trying to make my life miserable over rules that didn't even apply to me because, surprise, my property isn't part of the HOA. She wasn't just annoying, she was relentless. And now, apparently, she was also a thief. The realization hit me like a jolt of cold electricity. Karen was stealing my power. My power! The same woman who'd lectured me about community standards was siphoning off my electricity like a parasite in yoga pants. I stood, frozen on the porch, fists balled, rage boiling just beneath the surface. I wanted to march over there and rip that cord out of the wall with my bare hands, but instead, something in me shifted. This wasn't just petty theft. This was war. Karen was the kind of neighbor who made you consider selling your house just to escape her. She wasn't loud or messy or the type to throw wild parties. No, that would have been too easy. Karen was worse. She was methodical, ruthless, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, even though my land sat clearly outside its jurisdiction. That tiny detail never seemed to matter to her. She wielded rule books like weapons and filed complaints like it was her full-time job. One time, she left a printed notice in my mailbox because I had left my wheelbarrow leaning against the fence for more than 24 hours. Another time, she threatened to report me to the board because my rooster crowed too early. I didn't even have a rooster. Karen didn't care. If something disrupted her perfect little world of manicured lawns and pastel flower beds, she went full-on dictator. She was the kind of woman who'd measure your grass with a ruler, then fine you if it was a millimeter too tall. And now this woman, this walking neighborhood nightmare in designer sunglasses and bedazzled hoodies that said "Live, Laugh, Love," was stealing my electricity like it was no big deal. The hypocrisy alone made my head spin. I could already imagine how she'd react if the roles were reversed. She'd have called the cops, the HOA, the mayor, and probably the president. There would be flyers on every door about the dangers of power theft and community betrayal. But because it was her, she figured she'd get away with it. I felt something cold settled in my chest, not just anger, but resolve. Marching over there and confronting her would have been satisfying, sure, but it would also be stupid. She'd twist it into harassment and slap me with a trespassing complaint faster than you could say cease and desist. No, I needed something better, bigger. I needed proof, hard, undeniable, nail-her-to-the-wall kind of evidence. So I turned back into my barn, pulled down my hunting camera from the shelf, and set it up right where she'd been plugging in. Motion activated, night vision, high resolution, the works. Let her come back. Let her think she was still getting away with it. Because if she wanted to play dirty, I was ready to dig in and go full scorched earth. Karen had declared war. She just didn't know I'd already started planning my first strike. The next morning I woke up before the sun and headed straight to the barn with a cup of coffee in one hand and my heart pounding like a war drum. I barely made it past the door before I yanked the memory card from the hunting camera and jammed it into my laptop. The video loaded, grainy at first, and then it sharpened and there she was. Karen, dressed in her usual overpriced yoga pants, oversized hoodie with glittery lettering, and a smug little smirk like she was queen of the night. She crept across the grass like a cartoon burglar, dragging that obnoxious orange extension cord behind her like it was a lifeline. My jaw dropped. She actually looked around, scanned the area like some kind of elite operative, and then calmly plugged her cord into the outlet on my barn wall like it was the most natural thing in the world. Not a care in sight, not a clue she was being recorded. The sheer audacity of it nearly made me spit out my coffee. I sat back in my chair, stunned for half a second, then started laughing. Not a normal laugh either. One of those deep, unhinged belly laughs that only come out when you're teetering on the edge of madness or genius. Karen had no idea what she had just handed me. This was gold. Better than gold. This was ammo. I could have stormed over there right then, shown her the footage, and watched her melt down on the spot. But something told me that would be too easy, too clean. Karen deserved worse. She deserved panic, paranoia, a slow-burning spiral of fear. So I spent the rest of the day running a series of tests. I turned off the power in my barn, watched the electric meter dip, then spike again when I flipped it back on. Then I did it again. And again, and each time I noticed the same pattern. When my power was off, Karen's house dimmed just a little. Her obnoxious flamingo lights flickered. Her porch camera went out for a second. It was all connected. My electricity was literally fueling her entire suburban fantasy. Air conditioning, garden lights, security systems, the works. She hadn't just stolen a little power, she had been running her whole damn house on my dime. That's when the idea hit me. If Karen loved the HOA so much, if she worshipped their rules and fines and bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo, then I'd give her exactly what she wanted. A taste of her own medicine, but with my own twist. I didn't need to call the cops or get into some shouting match on the lawn. I was going to make her believe she had triggered something far worse. A violation from an HOA she had never even heard of. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting what might be the most terrifyingly official-looking letter I had ever written. "Dear homeowner," it began, "it has come to our attention that unauthorized power consumption has been detected at your residence. Under the Farm Utility Homeowners Association Compliance Guidelines, Section 12.5, subsection B, all non-compliant electrical usage is subject to immediate penalty. Assessed fees $10,000. Failure to remit payment within 14 days will result in further consequences, including but not limited to power disconnection, lien placement, and legal action under the FA Compliance Act." I read it over twice. It was perfect, confusing, legalistic, scary, just vague enough to sound real, and just specific enough to seem urgent. Then I called my buddy Tim, who used to work in a law office. I asked him to format it properly, make it look like it came from some kind of government body. He added letterhead, a fake compliance seal, and the cherry on top, a red final notice stamp across the front. We even printed a custom envelope to match. The next morning, I sat on my porch and watched the delivery guide walk up to Karen's house and drop the envelope in her mailbox. She came outside 5 minutes later in a ridiculous floral robe and fuzzy slippers, wearing the permanent scowl of someone who thought everyone else on earth was doing life wrong. Then she spotted the envelope. Her eyes narrowed. She picked it up cautiously as if it might explode. Then she opened it. And that was when the magic happened. Her face drained of color so fast I thought she was about to faint. Her jaw fell open. She let out a strangled gasp that could have scared the cows. Then, clutching the letter like it was a death sentence, she ran back into her house and slammed the door shut behind her. I sat back in my chair, took a long sip of coffee, and smiled. The trap had been set, and Karen had just walked straight into it. For the next few hours after Karen disappeared into her house, things were eerily quiet. Too quiet. I knew she was in there spiraling, pacing around her kitchen with that fake HOA letter clutched in her manicured hands, probably rereading every line and trying to convince herself it was a mistake. But Karen didn't do well with uncertainty. She was the kind of person who needed control, like most people need oxygen, and the idea that she had somehow broken a rule she didn't even know existed must mean eating her alive. She couldn't call the real HOA for help because, as far as she knew, this was the real HOA. She couldn't ignore it either because that would go against everything she believed in. I could practically hear her anxiety scratching at the walls. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I let it ring. No voicemail. That meant she was either too panicked to speak or trying to think 2 steps ahead. I glanced across the yard and spotted her standing on her front lawn, phone in one hand, letter in the other, pacing back and forth like a general planning a counterattack. Her expression was a mix of fury and fear and was absolutely glorious. Then came the next phase of the meltdown. Greg, her husband, the poor guy always looked like he was one HOA meeting away from faking his own death and starting over in the woods. I watched as she dragged him out onto the porch, shoved the letter into his hands, and started waving her arms so wildly I thought she might take flight. Greg read it with the same blank look he probably gave most of Karen's daily disasters, scratched his head, muttered something, and went back inside. Clearly, Greg was not interested in waging war with the Farm Utility Homeowners Association. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no, I heard her printer firing up like a war machine. She printed out what had to be 20 pages of who knows what. HOA bylaws, fake legal codes, her own personal manifesto. Then she marched out and began assembling her army. One by one, the neighbors started showing up. Most of them looked like they'd been dragged along out of guilt or fear or sheer habit, probably the same ones who secretly loathed Karen but were too polite to say no. Within the hour, a group of middle-aged warriors had formed at the edge of my property, led by Karen, who was now holding my fake letter like it was a sacred scroll. I walked out onto my porch just in time to meet the invasion. "Afternoon, Karen," I said, playing dumb as I leaned against the railing. "Something wrong?" She stomped toward me, holding the letter out like it was a lawsuit. "Jade, do you have any idea what this is?" I took the letter, pretended to read it with curiosity, and nodded slowly. "Looks like a power bill," I said. "Steep one, too." Her eye twitched. "This is a scam. A completely fraudulent charge. This FAA doesn't even exist." I raised an eyebrow and pointed to the header. "Of course it exists. It says so right there." The crowd behind her started to shift uncomfortably. One woman, Patricia, whispered something and took a small step back. Karen spun around and glared at her so fiercely that Patricia almost fell over her own feet. "It's fake," Karen snapped. "Someone is trying to extort me." "Oh, that's awful," I said, trying to sound sympathetic, but just out of curiosity. "Why would you even get a notice like this in the first place?" Karen froze. The color drained from her face for just a second before she caught herself and puffed up like an angry peacock. "That is a ridiculous accusation. I would never—" I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and watched as the crowd fell into silence. The video played in crystal clarity. Karen sneaking across my property, plugging in her extension cord like a criminal raccoon, then scurrying back to her house under the cover of night. No one said a word. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The neighborhood army began to retreat, pretending they suddenly remembered dentist appointments or grocery errands. I sighed, shook my head. "Look, Karen, I don't want to escalate this, but this—" I held up the letter. "This is serious. You might want to just pay the bill and move on." Karen's nostrils flared. "I am not paying a fake power bill." I shrugged. "Then I guess the FAA will have no choice but to take further action." "There is no FAA. Funny," I said, pulling out a second document, "because I just got this audit report from the FAA compliance office." I handed her a printed spreadsheet filled with fake stats and jargon. "Says here, your house has been drawing more power than anyone else in the neighborhood." "That's a major violation." Karen made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a scream, then turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard one of her flamingo lawn ornaments tipped over. I knew it wasn't over. Karen never accepted defeat. She'd be up all night digging, scheming, trying to find some loophole to wriggle through. But what she didn't know was that I had one more card to play, one final move that would push her right over the edge. I pulled out my phone and made the call. "Hey, Tim," I said, "you still got that suit and clipboard?" Tim laughed on the other end. "Oh, this is going to be good." "Damn right," I said. "Time to send in the inspector." The next morning I was already on my porch before the sun had fully risen, coffee in hand, eyes locked on Karen's house like a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. She hadn't made a peep since yesterday's showdown, no angry emails, no passive-aggressive HOA memos, nothing. That silence wasn't peace, it was tension, the kind that buzzes in the air before a storm. She was either plotting a revenge campaign or trying to erase all evidence of her midnight electricity heist. Either way, she had no idea what was coming. Right on cue, Tim pulled into my driveway in a dented sedan that somehow made him look more official than a government agent. He stepped out wearing a cheap black suit, sunglasses, clipboard in hand, and a no-nonsense expression that could scare a lawyer into confession. His hair was slicked back, his tie crooked just enough to look like he was too busy enforcing rules to fix it, and the fake badge clipped to his breast pocket read, FAA Compliance Officer. We exchanged a silent nod. Showtime! Tim walked across the yard with the confidence of a man who had audited 1,000 homes and ruined twice as many lives. He didn't knock gently. He rang the doorbell 3 times with the impatience of a federal agent on a deadline. I leaned forward in my chair, heart thumping. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and there stood Karen, still in her fuzzy robe, hair frazzled, face pale like she hadn't slept. She looked less like the neighborhood tyrant and more like someone in the middle of a very slow breakdown. "Good morning, ma'am," Tim said, flipping a page on his clipboard. "I'm here to conduct a formal compliance review regarding unauthorized power consumption under the Farm Utility Homeowners Association." Karen blinked. "The what?" Tim sighed, like he had explained this far too many times before. "The FAA, ma'am. You should have received our initial notice." Karen held up the letter like a weapon. "This is a scam. I don't owe anyone $10,000. Tim nodded seriously, making another mark on his clipboard. "According to our records, your property has been consuming power through unauthorized external sources, which places you in direct violation of subsection B, Article 12. Karen opened her mouth, then shut it, then opened it again. "This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyer." "Of course, ma'am," Tim said calmly. "You are within your rights. However, I must inform you that non-compliance will result in additional penalties, including power disconnection and lien placement." Karen looked like she might throw up. "You can't shut off my power." Tim gestured to her front lawn. "I see decorative lighting that would be considered non-essential consumption. Those would be the first to go." Karen's eyes darted to her precious pink flamingos, their plastic feathers gleaming in the morning sun. She clutched the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "This is insane," she whispered. Tim clicked his pen and made another note. "Just to clarify, ma'am, you are refusing to remit payment?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hands trembled. Tim pulled out a bright orange notice from his folder and pressed it to the front door like a sheriff posting an eviction. "Official disconnection warning," he said flatly. "You'll want to make arrangements before the deadline." Karen let out a sound between a whimper and a gasp, snatched the notice, and bolted back into her house. Tim walked back across the yard with the slow swagger of a man who had just delivered judgment. Once he stepped onto my porch, his serious mask cracked into a grin. "She's cracking," he said, taking the beer I handed him. I raised my bottle. "To the FAA." 2 days later, the real power company showed up, but not for me. I was on my porch again, same chair, same coffee, same smug grin, when the utility truck rolled up and parked right in front of Karen's house. I nearly choked on my drink from laughing too hard. It was happening. Well, I didn't know exactly what she'd done. Maybe she'd tried to call them to prove the FAA was fake. Maybe she thought getting ahead of the story would help her spin it in her favor. But whatever the reason, she'd poked the wrong bear. The technician got out, clipboard in hand, tool belt swinging, and walked straight up to Karen's door like he meant business. A few minutes later, she stepped outside, looking even more frazzled than before, hair in a messy bun, eyes wide with the haunted expression of someone who knew the walls were closing in. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw the moment it turned. Her arms were flailing again, the technician was shaking his head, pointing at something on his clipboard. Then came the shouting, not from the tech, from Karen, loud, desperate, chaotic yelling, the kind that had no logic, just panic. Greg appeared behind her looking like he wanted to dissolve into mist and float away. He muttered something, tried to calm her down, but Karen spun on him like a storm. "You're supposed to be on my side," she shouted, her voice carrying all the way to my porch. Greg threw up his hands. "I told you not to plug into the damn barn, Karen." That's when I knew the situation had gone nuclear. The technician didn't budge. After a few more minutes of yelling and foot stomping, one of which sent her slipper flying halfway across the yard, Karen finally stormed back inside and slammed the door hard enough to make her lawn flamingos wobble like they were preparing to evacuate. I learned later from a friend at the power company that the inspection had uncovered multiple violations: illegal modifications, unsafe wiring, unauthorized usage, and enough tampering to earn her a fine not of $10,000, but $25,000. They were even considering criminal charges. Apparently Karen's little energy heist had triggered red flags in the system, and now the state was looking into it. The best part? The electric company disconnected her modifications on the spot, meaning Karen would be living without her decorative lights, her outdoor AC units, and whatever other nonsense she'd been powering on my tab. Her perfect suburban dream dimmed. But the story didn't end there. Oh no. About a week later, the HOA held their monthly meeting at the clubhouse. Word had already spread. Karen's meltdown, the fake letter, the real fines, the technician's showdown. She still tried to show up, tried to rally support, tried to act like the whole thing had been some elaborate prank pulled on her by a criminal mastermind. But no one was buying it anymore. Even her most loyal followers had grown tired of her nonsense. When she stood up to speak, a few members just rolled their eyes, others flat out ignored her. And when she demanded that the HOA step in to help with her fines, they shut her down completely. "That's not our jurisdiction," one board member said. "You're on your own." Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. She mumbled something about personal attacks, bias, and community betrayal, then stormed out of the meeting with her binder of complaints clutched to her chest like a wounded soldier. The next day an email went out to all HOA residents. Karen was stepping down from her role as president, citing personal reasons. Just like that, the reign of Karen was over. I never got my $10,000. Never expected to. But what I got instead was better. Justice, payback, and hands down the most satisfying front row seat to a self-inflicted public downfall I'd ever seen. And just to put the cherry on top, I went out to the barn later that week and hung a brand new wooden sign right above the outlet Karen used to steal from. The letters were bold, hand-carved, and painted bright red. It read, "Headquarters of the Farm Utility Homeowners Association," just in case she ever got any more bright ideas.